Hello and welcome to this short video from Face Value Performance Psychology. My name's Glenn Mead and today I'm going to be talking about coaching for perspective. I think the power of coaching is allowing executives and leaders and managers at all levels to take a pause from their normal daily work and have someone help them question the so what of the situations they're facing. Specifically, how might I feel in the event of something happening? What will I think and what will I do? And with that awareness, that raise insight, what plans will I make and how will I implement those if this happens? So we question, so what about my situation? What are my options? What's my emotional reaction to that? What likely thoughts am I going to have and what do I need to do and how will I behave? And if it does happen, then here are my options. And the aim is to help the individual being coached to come away with increased confidence that they have some control in the event of a situation or event happening. And of course, the best way to do that is by asking questions. This is the bread and butter of any coach. And the types of questions to be aware of are closed and open questions. Closed questions typically elicit a yes or no answer or have a limited choice. And a limited choice of question gives rise to a limited range of answers. A closed question gives rise to a closed answer. Limited range, restricted meaning, and they don't facilitate dialogue. No conversation naturally develops from that if the coach is limiting the range of around which that conversation can develop. An open question, however, typically beginning with something like what, why, when, how, where, and who, gives rise to an open range of answers. And within this wide range of possible answers, it opens up dialogue and discovery. But more importantly, at a neuroscientific level, we know that language, which is processed in your frontal lobe, when the activity is increased in that area, it helps to reduce emotional thinking. And it's emotional thinking we would like to avoid because it clouds our ability to think logically, ends up giving us a narrow range of options, and at the end of the day, it doesn't make us feel any better or any more control. So when it comes to perspective, I think we can all find ourselves in situations where we just ability to think as clearly as we would like to. And it usually starts off with some sort of pressure or stress causing us to focus on a narrow range of specific actions or options or things that might come challenging us. And this is just normal. It's normal survival thinking that instead of being overwhelmed by lots of information in our periphery, we narrow our focus onto that which we find to be most challenging or taxing. And the trouble with that is that we can end up in what we call all or nothing thinking. Instead of seeing a wide range of options, we go into binaries, we're going to polarized thinking. That's either one thing or the other, and there's nothing in between. And following on from that all or nothing thinking comes more thinking errors, the typical tricks where our brain will jump into conclusions, we magnify problems out of proportion, we minimize the positive effect that we're having, we filter in negative facets of information and filter out the things that could bolster us and give us some confidence. We become experts in mind reading what other people are thinking about us without actually asking and confirming. And we can find ourselves experiencing imposter syndrome or phonyism when we think any moment now we're going to be detected and we're going to be found out and we'll be proven that we're not up to the job. If this goes on for too long without the ability to put things back into perspective, we can find our style of making sense of the world, we call our explanatory style, becoming a little bit rigid. So the 3 Ps come up where we talk about it's pervasive. Whatever we see happening in the world and our ability to do anything about it is pervasive. It's going to be everything. I'm rubbish at everything. Nothing I do is good enough. And no matter what, my problems are widespread and universal rather than just limited to one thing. The problem is permanent. It's not just temporary and it's going to go away shortly, but it's there all the time. And the sense of it being very personal about there's nothing I can do about it can become overwhelming. And this explanatory style is shown to be related to things like depression and burnout. We find our mindset becomes fixed with a sort of cynical or reactive response to opportunities, questioning, challenging, disbelieving, as opposed to having a growth mindset where we're more optimistic and proactive. And all the time our vision and focus is getting narrower and narrower, up to the point where our belief in our inability to achieve something, what we call our self-efficacy, becomes restricted, and we can get into a stage of what we call learned helplessness, when nothing we do is really going to make any difference, and we believe that's going to be the case forever and ever. Now, it's easy to lose perspective. When we talk about perspective, we probably normally think about visual perspective. And it's really quite easy just to play around with optical illusions and see what effect it has on what we believe to be real or not. So take this example here. We've got three identical figures, cut and paste and put onto this PowerPoint slide, and they're all exactly the same size. But all we need to do is put some lines of reference to link the three of them together, and you can see the effect that that optical illusion is now having on your brain. All of a sudden, one of those soldiers appears to be a giant, and another one appears to be very small indeed. But actually, if you just bring the objects to the same level on the horizontal line, you can see again that they're all the same size. Now, we do this cognitively as well in our mind's eye about how we see the situation around us, and how close it is, how big it is, and how challenging it is. And with that heightened emotionality, without the ability to discuss using dialogue to put it into perspective, where our emotions can get the better of us, and we steadily lose the ability to say, okay, logically and reasonably and rationally and relation to each other, what is the environment around me? And we can find ourselves being overwhelmed and not being able to see the wood for the trees. But we can regain perspective by using a specific technique that's been shown with clinical populations to improve logical thinking, reduce emotional thinking, and help individuals regain a sense of control over their lives. And this technique is called psychological distance, and researched in 2010 by two researchers, one called Özlem Ayduk, another called Ethan Kross. And they found through their research that by manipulating the way people think about things and changing their thoughts, they can reduce emotional thinking, and they can reduce the physical or physiological stress reaction that goes along with it, such as increased heart rate, increased adrenaline going through your bloodstream, blood pressure going up, palpitations, nervousness, all the things related to having a stress reaction. What they didn't expect were the positive results of their test and their experiment, which was that individuals who successfully used the psychological distance technique displayed increased physical endurance, and most importantly, an increased resistance to temptation. So they were able to delay their need for instant gratification, had greater staying power, greater resilience, greater perseverance. So what is it they did? Let's have a look at their take on perspective. Their researchers suggested there are really two ways of looking at the world around you. You can have concrete thinking, which is using your 6 or 7 senses to make sense of what's going on around you. So things you can physically see and hear and touch and taste and smell and feel touching your skin, and you can sense its presence in the here and now. Now, they named this lower order thinking, and they noticed that with lower order thinking, concrete thinking, it was more emotional. There's more sort of an instant, right here, right now, lived experience to it. Compare that with abstract thinking, which they said is a little bit further out there, it's more distant, and it's more undefined, misshapen, maybe nebulous, maybe like cloud-like. And with this comes higher order thinking. And they noticed that there was a difference in the emotionality, that the further something away is, the more abstract it is, the less emotional, because it's not here, right now, and it's not sort of in your face. And they found that by manipulating the way individuals think across 4 domains, they could play around with the psychological distance and thereby either reduce or increase the emotional thinking. So these 4 domains were a time domain, a scale domain, social domain, and probability. And let's quickly look at each one in turn. Firstly, the sense of time. Our emotional thinking brain is keeping us alive right here, right now. It doesn't deal very well with looking into the past or predicting the future. It's trying to keep you alive straight away. But when we're faced with challenges of planning for the future, the problem here is that when under pressure, everything can seem as if it needs to be done right here, right now, that everything's in your face and there's an urgency to it. But in reality, it's not like that. Take, for example, someone who is being challenged with giving an important presentation to a board, and it's not happening for another 6 weeks, but they'll be stressing and worrying about it as if they're 5 minutes away waiting to go into the boardroom to do the presentation. But contrast that to someone who's got a 3-year degree to do and are thinking about getting a good grade at year 3. But year 3 is so far away that maybe they're a little bit more complacent. So the manipulation of time can have an effect on that emotionality. But when under pressure and when we've lost perspective, everything seems to be urgent. It's right here, right now, and I must deal with it. So to help someone by coaching and using these 4 domains of psychological distance, you can ask a question such as this: how soon are things likely to happen? Whatever it is you're concerned about or worried about or anxious about, how soon is it going to happen? And you find it's not all happening at the same time, on the same date, at the same hour. There'll be a difference there. And through this conversation and dialogue, we're able to then say, well, so okay, from what you've discussed and what you've explained, what now are your priorities of work? And priority meaning putting one thing before the other. Everything cannot be a priority. One thing must be more important than the other. And maybe out of this discussion, it comes close to the realization that some other things which are not so important need to be put off or delayed. The second domain then was to do with scale, also called space. And this is to do with the proxemics, the closeness and the size of the perceived challenge. And of course, things that are closer to us appear bigger, and things that are further away appear further away and smaller. And that's just natural. But when our emotional brain is trying to deal with it, everything can feel like it's huge, and it's going to have a massive effect if we don't deal with it right now. So the questions for this would be, how big is the problem you're thinking of? Compare it with other things. What is the sort of impact it's going to have? And if it were to happen? And let's put these now in order of scale, which things are going to have the biggest impact and need to be dealt with sooner rather than later. How do they all compare to each other? And again, from this, the question, the answer, the solution that will come out of it will be, what are your priorities now? What things really must be taken care of? What other things can wait, but we need to be wary of the consequence and the impact of it and be able to prepare ourselves to deal with that potential negative consequence. The third domain coming from this and is all to do with the perception of social involvement or social immersion, where our emotional thinking brains are firing off because we're under pressure and we can't see the wood for the trees. Then there's a sense of it's whatever bad is going to happen, it's going to happen to you. You're involved. There's no way of escaping it. And no one else is experiencing this, or no one else has experienced this. So we can find ourselves feeling out of our depth, overwhelmed, sinking, drowning, whatever metaphor you want to use for it. But the sense of it is, am I coping or am I not coping? And it's only me. Everyone else is doing fine. So you can start off by saying, how in deep do you feel? And getting some sense of scaling this and saying, this is emotionally how I'm feeling about it. Really, how well am I doing? And you can follow up by another question and say, well, how in deep do you need to be? Is it possible you could just dip your toe in the water and then up to your middle of your leg and up to your knee, above the knee, and then fully immerse yourself over a period of time to become acclimatized and more confident in dealing with what you're dealing with? Do you need to take everything on all at the same time? And with that sense of isolation or being the only person who's ever experienced this, another question would be, well, who else is involved? Other peers, other colleagues, other team members that are experiencing the same thing as you, how useful would it be to have a conversation about that? Or is there anyone in your office or your industry who's been there, seen it, done it, got the t-shirt, written the book, who has experienced the same as you, who would be useful to talk to in the form of mentoring or coaching? So you're not alone, but our emotional brains make us think that way because we're responsible for our own actions, and that part of your brain will be saying, get ready for fight, flight, freeze, because this feels like a threat and a challenge. And the final domain, the fourth domain, is to do with probability. When under pressure, when we lose perspective, we not only think that everything needs to be done right here, right now, that it's huge impact, I'm the only person who can deal with it, but we're absolutely convinced it's definitely going to happen. Because for survival reasons, our emotional brain doesn't like to take a gamble and say, okay, well, on a scale of 1 to 10 or on a rating of up to 100%, what's the likelihood of this coming or happening? And I'll take a punt it might not happen. For survival reasons, your brain says it's either going to happen or it's not going to happen. But life isn't like that. So you could say, well, what are the chances of that it will happen? And if it's not 100% certain, then what could you do then? What other options do you have? And well, the principle of this is the coaching dialogue is opening up those parts of the frontal lobe where language is processed and is allowing dialogue to develop. And from that dialogue will come a reframed perspective, maybe some reduced anxiety, maybe options or plans for action. And when we've got options and plans for action and we can go and implement them, then our sense of confidence and well-being increases and our emotionality decreases. So with a probability, even if it is a certainty, what will you do first? So bad things happen. Okay, lots of things not out of control. What are you going to do about it? What one thing will you go and do? And again, with verbalizing this one thing that we will go and do in the event of something untoward happening, gives us a reinforced sense of control. Now, of course, you don't have to be in a formal coaching relationship to use this technique. You could use it socially in order to engage and establish relationships with other people in the office in order to improve their own well-being. So imagine having a dialogue with two colleagues in the office, and one will say, how are you? And the traditional typical answer probably from a male will come back saying, well, I'm fine, thanks. Well, look, if you're got responsibility for line management or leadership or well-being of staff, don't accept fine, because we know it means feeling inwardly negative every day. So you could ask a question, are you okay? But that's a closed question, giving rise to a yes, no. So change it into a quantitative question. You could ask, how okay are you? But that just doesn't sound natural. So let's think about the domains of psychological distance. You could say something like, how are things at the moment? With at the moment being in italics, because it suggests there is different time and different place. Now, things in the past may have been better, things in the future might get better, and there is a possibility that it will change. So you're not saying it's fixed and it's pervasive and it's permanent and it's personal. It's right here, right now. How is it for you, and what then might change? You could follow it up by saying, so what's your biggest challenge at the moment? Which assumes there are other challenges which are not as big, and that your focus might be on the one that you feel most worried about. Then, how have you handled it before? Suggesting that because you're still alive and I'm talking to you, you did survive it, and you have been able to handle it before. And now let's just reflect on what you did last time and regenerate those memories of, yes, you are skilled, and yes, you are competent, and you can manage it, more or less. Then the next question is about who else is involved. Who else has been through this before, to make you realise or help the other individual realise that they're not alone in experiencing whatever it is they're experiencing. And perhaps if they're prone to feeling a sense of control and needing to do everything themselves and not delegating and taking too much on, you could say who in your team is a real help. And maybe that'll open up the possibility of saying in what way could they support you, in what way could you go and ask for their help. And then ultimately, but I'm not always suggesting this is the final question you could ask, you could hypothesize and say, if you had to let a project drop, which would it be? Because we've got to be truthful with ourselves when it comes to managing resources and prioritizing. Eventually, ultimately, there will be something that is at the bottom of the list. And rather than wanting to say, no, I can't, or letting someone down, it's better to recognize and acknowledge what things cannot always be done, and then to come up with some contingency for managing that. So if you had to let one project drop, which would it be? Not an ideal thing, and not suggesting this becomes a routine practice, but it allows people to engage their logical brain and say, well, actually, on the scale of things, I can see what's really important, and I can see what is less important, but still needs to be dealt with. So there are a few tips about how to use your questioning technique within coaching in order to engage psychological distance, to allow the frontal lobe of the brain to come up with more logical, evidence-based solutions to the issues we have, and to put things in perspective.